just aren't getting enough. We are not getting enough, Amanda, so thanks for bringing it. Dr. Jamar Tisby last week started that conversation in adult education, the forum. So, but you can assume that people know the language, and many know more than others. It's a clean slate, though. All right, do what you got to do. So we are so glad to have Amanda. Amanda preached here last summer. If you remember, she is ordained in the Disciples of Christ Church, correct? Yes, very good. Amanda was the executive director of the Interfaith Alliance in Denver, quite respected director of that organization. We thank you. Now she is the director of the Institute of Religion, Politics, and Culture at the Iliff School of Theology. Amanda is Reverend, but almost doctor. She's finishing her doctorate. We are so glad you're here. We wish you luck. We are so glad you're here, and would you join me in thanking Amanda?
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for that kind welcome, Clover. I'm always grateful to be with you all. I had so much fun preaching here over the summer, and have had great conversations. Also have a long history of working with so many people here who are engaged in social justice issues, and as Clover mentioned, anything that you're not allowed to talk about at a dinner party, that's my specialty. So sitting next to me on an airplane or going with me to a party is the worst, because people say, "What do you do?" And I'm like, "Oh, here we go." So I am grateful to be here with you, especially on a Sunday after an election. And these topics that we're going to talk about today have been really front of mind. And we are still in the process of finding out some of the results from the election. So I'm happy to talk about all of those things. I also wanted to say it was named as a lecture. I'm not going to lecture you so much as to engage in a conversation. And I didn't bring slides because I've been hearing and getting feedback that people are screened out or mid-COVID still. In this fuzzy COVID land, we're all tired of screens and Zoom. So we're gonna have a conversation. And if there is something that is burning that you're like, I don't understand that, please raise your hand at any point. Less like a comment that you want to share your perspective on it. We can do some of that at the end. But if there's something that I say that's like, say more, don't be afraid to raise your hand or say it. I'm all good with that. Our topic today is Christian nationalism, and white Christian nationalism. And I understand that you all have been talking about this a little bit. It's also, I don't know if it's just in my circles that I see all of the things, but I feel like there have been a lot of webinars, conversations, articles in the newspaper. The front page of the Denver Post, I think about 6 weeks ago, had an article about Christian nationalism, specifically in relation to one of our Colorado candidates for the House, Lauren Boebert, so we can talk about her because she's pretty clear about talking about it up front. So it's been on our minds, this topic of Christian nationalism. So the first question that I want to discuss is, what is Christian nationalism? And I understand you also talked about this a little bit last week, so I'm going to add the definition that I would give to what Christian nationalism is. It is this ideology that to be American means to be Christian, and it is also an intentional effort to embed Christian ideas, structures, teachings into our political structures, and to preference Christianity and Christians in our culture, society, and political lives. And this isn't just an idea or a theory, but it is a political movement, and it's a very intentional movement that's been happening for a long time, but not forever. So that's a couple things about what it is. And when we say Christian, this is one of the biggest questions, right? Like, whose version of Christianity are we talking about when we say that Christian values and ideas should be woven into our policy and our culture? Most often, those who are talking about a Christian nation are clearly talking about one particular view and understanding of what it means to be Christian. And often that's not really based in scripture, tradition, or history, but very much more a political understanding of Christianity. So, does that make sense as the definition of Christian nationalism? Okay, one of the questions that we so often get is, well, what is the difference between this reality that there were a lot of Christians, Protestant Christians particularly, who were involved in the founding of what came to be the United States of America? Yes, that's true, and it was not this utopian Christianity that people seem to have this imagined historical story of. So I do think it's important to name the ways that Christianity as a tradition was influential in how the earliest people who came to this land, who were explorers from Europe, how they understood themselves and how they understood what they were doing as they came to this land and expanded and colonized. And so that's where I like to start, actually, with an understanding of Christian nationalism, is with the doctrine of discovery. Who knows the doctrine of discovery? This is a fascinating thing to me because I never learned about it in school. It wasn't until later that I've learned about it. And I think that it's such an important piece of how we understand ourselves as Americans now, is still tied up in these assumptions. So the doctrine of discovery was a papal bull that was put forth in 1493. What would have been happening in 1493? So the Spanish had just left. Columbus was discovering the New World, and explorers were coming upon, European explorers were encountering these lands and the people who lived in those lands, and they were trying to figure out how to navigate that space. So the Catholic Church in Spain put forth a papal bull, a guide for how the world is and how you should respond, that said that those beings that the explorers, the Spanish Christian Catholic explorers encountered, if they weren't Christian and they weren't civilized, and what does civilized mean? Look like them, dress like them, talk like them, eat like them, that's civilized. Have families and partners like them. If they're not Christian and they're not civilized, then they're not human. So do what you will. You can take their land, you can take their people, you can enslave and exploit, commit genocide, and it's outside of the normal expectations of how you treat another person. And that laid the groundwork and gave this moral justification or a moral pass. You know, we can look back with our lens now and think, how did people do that? Like, how were they okay with themselves, and how did they reconcile their Christianity? Well, this gave them a pass. These aren't people. You're fine, so do what you will. And that really, set in motion, and honestly, it was happening before that during the Crusades and the encounter with Islam in the medieval world, and there are some scholars that can really tell you a lot more about that than I can. But these wheels were being put in motion. And with the doctrine of discovery, as the colonizing world was taking shape, it set this hierarchy of who was human and civilized and Christian and who was not, and what that meant for our material well-being and the way that we treat one another. And I would argue that that way of seeing ourselves and seeing other people in this degrees of humanity is still deeply woven in our psyche. And I do a lot of work on homelessness and talking about these differences in how people are dehumanized based on race, class, gender, sexuality, ability. We have these expectations of who deserves what and who doesn't. So that, to me, is this groundwork of a way that the political power structure, not the scriptural teaching, shaped how Christianity played out in the colonizing world, that it was a superior, higher level of humanity. And so when people today, how 550 years later or whatever, think about and talk about, well, to be American is to be Christian, there are still threads of who is American, who is human, who deserves to be here, who deserves a voice, a seat at the table, that continues to be rooted in that hierarchical ordering where Christianity is tied to civilization and what it means to be human. So hold that. But that is not what so many of us think about when we think about what it means to be Christian, right? I mean, as someone who is Christian, what does that mean to you to say I am Christian? Some words. What does it mean to be Christian? Humble, Christ, compassionate, inclusive, love one another. These are the things that I think about when I think about what it means to be Christian, when I think about the teachings of Jesus. And so it's really important when we talk about Christian nationalism, and this is where it gets really mixed up in our public discourse, and as someone who is a candidate running for public office, is using their Christianity as a card that makes them more credible and more moral and more human and more deserving than those who aren't. And we see this play out in so many different ways. So to be Christian, or what does it mean, Christian nationalism? It means tying up this particular ideology of Christianity and a political Christianity within our courts, within our laws, within our legislative practices, as well as within our culture, cultural norms. So that is what Christian nationalism is. What it is not is a historical understanding of Christianity. It's not biblical. We know that, right? It's also not something that our early founders understood themselves. So this is the other, we talked about the founding of this land and how Western Christians came to be in this land that is called the United States was through this path of the colonial project. Well, in the 1700s, which was 300 years after that, when those people were deciding on the Constitution, the structures, figuring out who they wanted to be as a democratic society and writing the Constitution, there were already ways that conflicts over who was Christian, who could be in power, who could be in elected office, were playing out in the colonies, in those early 13 colonies. Some were already named as Catholic. Some were already named as Baptist. Some were already named as having religious freedom, Delaware. So they were already playing this out before they had decided to come together and write a constitution that applied to all of the colonies and how they would go forward in the future. So these questions of whose religion is valid, whose religion gives them credibility and power, at the signing of the Constitution and in the discourse around that, there was a clear decision that they were not going to be a religious state, that there was not going to be a barrier for entry based on your religion or your religious practice or tradition or confession. So that's why they put in the First Amendment of the Constitution that there was freedom of religion, freedom to believe as you will, freedom to practice as you will, and freedom from religion, in that there will be no test for elected office based on religion. There will be no preference to any particular religion in our laws, in our structures, and there will be no indoctrination of religion within our society. Now, these are all ideals because those things were all present from the beginning, and they still are. We still have actually funding for many religious groups that are providing social services, foster care services, homelessness, housing, health care. Religious groups are doing all of those things and receiving government funding for them. So just to be clear, we aren't in a completely religiously neutral. Also, there are tax benefits to being a religious institution. So, and what is a religious institution? That's pretty broadly interpreted. So there isn't some perfect land where we have separated church and state, nor do I think that's possible, but that's another topic. So, so religious freedom, Christian nationalism, what is it? And then what is it not? Not biblical, not historical, not constitutional. And so why are we talking about it so much right now? What do you all think? Answers of why we're talking about this so much right now. Say that again. Fear, politics, hatred, fear, power. So these seeds have been growing. Oh, did you have something back there? People are loud. Like, this minority has a very loud voice and very strategic voice, right? So it's bubbling up right now in ways that we haven't really seen so clear, so visibly, or with such a critical mass, or in like mainstream politics. There have always been fringe people who kind of have an opinion that everybody says, well, that's wacky, but it's only a couple people and they don't have any power, so we're not worried about it too much, right? That's happened for a long time. But there has, since the 1970s, specifically, in response to a lot of the culture change that was happening throughout the 60s, giving more rights and equality and freedom to people of color, to women, to LGBTQ folks. So those pieces of culture change we can see as prompting this backlash to the cultural and political power norms of a white, Western, Christian, patriarchal understanding of ourselves and each other and how things should be. And this has been happening for a long time, and there's been an effort to build political power toward that. There have been efforts to build our cultural expectations around that. This has been happening very intentionally with a lot of money for 50 years. And now we're seeing some of the fruits of those efforts. And one of those that I think is important to talk about is the Supreme Court. And there are people who are telling their stories now who were at the table in the 1980s and 1990s and a part of movements who were actively trying to move the Supreme Court, seeing that that was a real place. You have people who are in office, lifelong office, who have a great amount of power and aren't responsible to the voters, and really working to bring a ideological conservative view of how to read the Constitution based in a originalism framework, and how to enact our laws in ways that very much favored the white, Western male, patriarchal, colonial perspective of who we are as unchanging and continuing a project from, 400 years ago that is so different than how we think about and see the world now, right? So this effort has been happening, and there's been money put into it. They've been training lawyers. They've been making lists of potential lawyers, and Christianity has been, and a particular form of Christianity was very much at the table through those conversations. And I recently, one of the people that I know is Rob Schenck, who was someone who was he was one of the founders of the religious right. He was one of the founders of the anti-abortion movement. And he has come to see how not in line with Christianity so much of the work that he was doing was. And so he's telling his stories. And there are more and more people in those spaces who are telling their stories of being at the negotiating table saying, how do we get the Supreme Court to be more aligned with one particular Christian view? And so that's one reason that we're talking about this right now, is that there has been a long-term intentional effort to plant these seeds, but that has not been visible. The places where I first was watching and was just struck was watching the insurrection on January 6th on TV. And I remember sitting there horrified and just kind of confused, honestly, and seeing Jesus 2020 flags and Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, and crosses being used to break windows into the Capitol, and people using this religious fervor and commitment and merging that with a idealization of a political person and party and movement, and realizing how prevalent that was and how shameless. I think that there's like this part of like, okay, I believe this, but I'm not going to put it out front. That is gone. And so there's much more willingness to walk outside with a flag or hang it across your vehicle that says, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, and merging these two things. And I think the other reason that we're talking about it more right now is that more people who were running for office in this past election named themselves clearly as Christian nationalists. And maybe, I don't know if they really know what that means, but many of them do. And if you follow the rabbit trails, you start to see, gosh, they are using this language intentionally because they know it resonates. And they know it resonates because they're getting mass support. And that means that there is this developing critical mass towards some of these very fringe ideas that we need to be paying attention to. We might be thinking, but the election actually was kind of a pushback on some of those folks, right? Like some of those most extreme people that we were most concerned about as people who are really working to support democracy and human rights and inclusion and to assure that Christianity and nationalism aren't merged into one. Most of these folks lost, but not all of them, number one, by far. And a lot of those races were very, very tight. So that means half of our population and our community is feeling like that's okay, or support it, or just aren't realizing that they want to stand up against it and to be more, give more credit. One of the people, of course, is Lauren Boebert, who we're still waiting to find out what that election results are, what those election results are. It's very close, as you probably all know. But she has been standing from a pulpit saying the church should be leading the government, and saying far more radical things, also evoking language of violence and blood. The blood of Christ is on us, and we are the people who are called to this fight. That is provocative, dangerous language. And the fact that half of the, even if it's half, I'm grateful that it was at least half have stood up, at least. That wasn't expected. But those kinds of things we need to be paying attention to. And I'm not coming to be like a partisan political, that's not my goal. And I'm often naming the fact that neither political party gets it right, especially on religion. I like to talk about that a lot with progressives and Democrats. But I think that we do need to be very clear of what is not speaking for Christianity as Christians, and ways of speaking politically and acting politically that are very much out of line with how, as a Christian leader, I understand myself and my community acting in the political sphere. So that caveat, as I start naming some names. The other person that we saw have great success this week was Ron DeSantis in Florida, the governor of Florida. Now, the Miami Herald did an incredible long piece on Ron DeSantis and the ways that he's been evoking Christianity and Christian nationalism over the past several years. And I can send all of these articles. I also did a podcast on this on Complexified. If you go to complexified.org or any of your podcast sites, we have a podcast on and talked about this and have the links there as well to these articles. So the Miami Herald did a tracing of the language in Ron DeSantis' speeches over the past several years. And what they found is a shift in the ways that he talks about Christianity and the ways that he evokes Christianity overtly in ways that are Christian nationalists, evoking Christian nationalist ideologies and sympathies. And it used to not, like, they are showing how he didn't do that before. And he has been intentionally changing his language to be more overtly Christian and Christian nationalist. And when I hear that, knowing how people work in the political sphere, I think he's doing that because it's polling well. And why is it polling well? Because there is traction happening in this movement. If they weren't getting traction, and so it's going to be interesting after this past week as people start to reflect on what worked and what didn't work and all of the blame games start to happen, is a Christian nationalist ideology or framing still resonating with more than half of the American public? This is to be seen. But all of the research that's been happening the past couple years with Pew, who does long research on religious topics, with PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, with some scholars, sociologists of religion, they've been showing this increase in the percentage of Americans who either identify or clearly say that America is a Christian country and Christianity should be woven into our laws, or what they call accommodators, who say, well, it's not a Christian nation, so I don't have a problem with Christianity being a part of our laws and assumptions in our legal and political structures. So half of the US population is shown to be in that space. That's a lot, and it's a lot who are kind of vulnerable to some of this language as it's heating up. So that's why it's growing right now, and that's why we are seeing so many people paying attention to it. As I mentioned, it's fluid, it's changing. We're all trying to figure out like how this is resonating for people, and when people start to say, that's enough, I don't, like, no, or when they continue to get on board. I think it's particularly dangerous because religious fervor has the power that not many other things do in our lives. How many people make decisions in their own life based on your religious commitments? Raise your hand. So many of us do, you know, that's why I'm here today, because of my commitment and my feeling of spiritual connectedness and longing to live into a better world. I make decisions on that. I've made sacrifices on that. I've taught my children in that way. That is not different for someone who has a very extreme view of things. Religious ideologies and fervor are powerful. Powerful in ways that even money isn't always powerful, or success isn't always powerful. People will make decisions that they wouldn't make otherwise, some people, if they feel a deep sense that this is what God wants them to do, or that they are a part of something bigger tied to God as beyond, right? So just keeping that in mind, and we see that over history, right? This isn't new. This is a part of who we are and a part of our long history. Okay, so who's depressed? Raise your hand. My job is done. Just kidding. Okay, so if you're going to talk about depressing things, one, you have to have a sense of humor, and two, you have to have ideas of how to move forward, right? Yes, yeah. Great question. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Did you all hear that? Okay, the question was that I named at the beginning white Christian nationalism, and the speaker last week also talked about the ways that race is tied up in Christian nationalism, and what is it about like the white part that is particular. Hopefully I named that correctly. What's the definition of white? Yeah, okay. Perfect. Okay, definition of white, great question. Not the color of your skin. That's truly. So we're talking about a power structure that is rooted in European, Northern, Western European standards of who is human, who is excellent, superior, what the norms are. This is all tied up in whiteness, and if you've done work on racial justice, and this is something that's talked about a lot, that you don't have to have white skin to be bought into this ideology that says that these ways of being that are tied to a historical, hierarchical ordering of humanity where white Europeans are at the top of the hierarchy, and then it moves down from there. So this is something that is deeply embedded, and we see it in the ways that people who are maybe not white-skinned but are very much bought into, this is how I become excellent and everyone else is inferior, and those ways of being and cultural assumptions, which are also tied up in patriarchy and often capitalism, and that these are the norms and everything else is less than. So that's one thing. And the particular ways that it gets tied up in white Christian nationalism is that there's an interesting phenomenon with people who feel that America should be a Christian nation, who are communities of color, who are Black churches, Latinx churches, who have this deep sense of Christianity and want that to be woven into our culture. But there's something particular of white Christian nationalism that is very exclusive, that only this group of people who fall into these norms are fully human and fully included in the circle. Excluded from that circle are Jewish folks who often have white skin, are people who are often Black skin and have different cultural norms and expectations. So it's as much about culture as it is about a skin color. But that skin color is a part of it. Does that make sense? It's confusing. Yeah.
Really uncomfortable with the way that some of the people who don't see life the way we do use the Bible.
Yeah.
Are there some lessons for us who see life differently about how we can avoid misquoting the Bible, misusing the Bible, misusing world history, church history, all those things? What can we learn from these people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so did you all hear that? What can we learn from these people who we see as distorting our, like I own it, Christian understanding or tradition? So that's a good question. I'm going to come back to that. So the first thing I want to talk about, can you all see me and hear me okay down here? I can see you a little bit better as we get into conversation. So is that better, Clover? You're telling me go back up. Okay. How do we not lock ourselves in a bunker and feel depressed with the ways that we are seeing once we start to go, oh, expletive. How do we deal with this? A couple of things that I think are really important, and they'll get to your question too. One is to remember history and to remember that people have always, throughout time and humanity, been in positions where, one, their government didn't represent them or care about them or speak for them. So there have always been situations where people were having to find life and connection and resilience in the midst of a very difficult, overwhelming opposition or forces that were bringing harm. So that's present in the Bible. This is one of the things I love about the Bible, is that it's really a mirror to our society and our history and our long story of trying to make our way, trying to find connection with God, trying to discern the right paths forward, and messing up over and over and over, and trying to find our way again. And so one is putting ourselves in history, that we aren't unique. I'm naming that there is a particular inflection that we should be paying attention to. This is not unique in the scope of history, and we have been here before as humanity. And we can continue to make our way and continue to plant seeds and to grow and weave connections and to speak out and to grow from that space. It's not hopeless. That's big. We can also look for those who are resisting and growing and creating new ways. For me, one of my favorite things that I think is so important is that when we talk about the white Western Christian colonial worldview, it is hierarchical and orders people based on all of their different identity categories, and it has a zero-sum kind of thinking that for me to survive, I have to take you out. I will do anything I have to do to be able to get ahead. That's a very particular worldview, but it's not the only worldview. There are other ways to see ourselves and to see how we live in relationship with one another. So I like to spend time learning about, listening to, thinking with people who are seeing themselves as interconnected, interdependent. My well-being is tied up in your well-being. If one of us is suffering, we are all suffering. This should be all familiar kinds of language, right? You've heard this before. We see this in the writings of Martin Luther King Jr. We see this in indigenous communities who have for, I don't know how long, been living with a worldview that says that we are all connected. We're connected to the rocks and the trees and the water and each other. And so that, for me, means living that way day to day. And I think that, honestly, that's what Jesus teaches, is that we are connected to one another. God is in me, God is in you. We are all a part of this universe that is connected, and part of our work is to deepen those connections of love. So, to me, that is where I find hope, I find energy and joy and fun. That's way more fun way to live to me than I have to beat you down so I can succeed. That's just anxiety producing to me. So finding those people, finding those organizations, finding those places where those kind of ways of being are being cultivated. Now, how do you do that in politics? This is my current hope, and is how do we start to facilitate working, this is what we're doing at the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture at ILIF, is working with people serving in public leadership, working with legislators, city leaders, school boards, to help them break those cycles and that assumption that this is the way the world is. It's a dog-eat-dog world. It's hierarchical. It's for me to succeed, you have to fail. How do we start to break those channels that say that that's how the world is? So those are things that I think that we can all be doing, is cultivating these different ways of being with each other, whether you're a business owner, whether you're a parent, a grandparent, in the community, whatever your work is, and the ways that you move through the world, how do you continue to foster that? With clarity of the way that this other way of understanding Christianity and ourselves as Americans is really hurtful. And so naming, like, that hurts me, that hurts the people I love, and starting from that place of heartbreak when you're trying to enter into those conversations. So how do we learn from this when we are, like, claiming our authority or expertise in something? I love, there's a lot of things that Augustine instilled that aren't great, but one that I love that Augustine instilled is the rule of love. That if I'm reading a scripture, if I am teaching something, if I am moving out in the world, is it furthering love? And this great definition of love is the, what is the first word of it? It's something like the radical delight. No, the non-possessive delight in the particularity of the other. So the non-possessive delight in the particularity of the other. So is the way that I am moving in the world, teaching something, saying that this thing has authority, is it furthering love in the world, or is it diminishing love in the world? That's my benchmark. And so for me, like as I look at some of these ways that I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so hurtful, that is a way to respond to it. Is it furthering love or not? And am I furthering love or not in the things that I say or do? The answer isn't always yes. But having that clarity of like, oh, okay, step back, take a breath, rethink. I have no idea what time it is, Clover, so let me look at the...
It is 10:22,
Okay.
so we have about 8 minutes
Okay,
or
perfect.
so for questions. If you have a question for Amanda, please.
I think I said
Raise
I
your
would give
hand.
more time for questions. Sorry I talked so much.
No, that's great. All right.
We've got one over here and one there, so yeah.
You talked about the doctrine of discovery, but I wanted to know if you could talk for a minute about the manifest destiny as well.
Great. Yeah, those are tied up together. So the question was about manifest destiny, and that is another one of those ideologies that really helped us give a moral pass and a justification, and that's also another example of how we will embark on behaviors that we never would see as okay if we have them tied to a God-ordained idea or justification. So that manifest destiny is this idea that it was our destiny as Europeans coming to the new land as tied up with our ideas of the promised land in our biblical stories, and seeing ourselves as white European settlers and pioneers as the chosen people who were moving into the promised land, and whatever we had to do to fulfill that destiny was okay. Be that slaughtering indigenous people, committing mass genocide, all of that was justified because this was our destiny. Yeah. Question over here, I think.
I'm curious what your thoughts on exposure to different thoughts are. When I encounter people that have kind of tended this far-right Christian nationalism thing, a lot of times it becomes pretty apparent that they might live in a place that doesn't have a mosque or a temple within 100 miles, right? And so, kind of fostering that, you need to sort of expand your horizons usually kind of meets a deaf ear. And I mean, how much do you think that plays in, and what are ways to counteract that?
Yeah, that's a great question of like, how does proximity to difference impact our ability to see outside of our own perspective? And I think it's huge. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we're facing right now, which is ironic because we have access to more different ideas than we've ever had in the arc of human history. And I don't say that very often because I'm careful to make sweeping historical statements, but I'm pretty sure that one is true. That with the internet and with our awareness of others, we should all have such a greater awareness, but we have siloed ourselves into our information bubbles and into our spaces where we feel comfortable in the things that we believe, and this goes for me too, are affirmed and rather than challenged, because challenging what we assume is really uncomfortable. So how do we have conversations with people who just simply haven't been outside of that bubble? And this could be a whole nother talk. And I'll say my family, my in-laws voted for Trump. They're still very Trump. They're very evangelical Christian. I'm not a Bible-believing Christian. I'm blocked from faith. Like, it's a very difficult dynamic, and my parents actually both also voted for Trump, and so I'm not unfamiliar with these situations. What I would say is that one of the best ways to, in those conversations, is to, when someone says something, to say, that's not my experience. That's not my experience. So you're making about your experience. in my experience, I have friends who are Muslim, and they're some of my closest friends. They're at, my children's baptism, or we do dinner together every Friday night. Is like humanizing, being a link. If they've never encountered someone who was different, this is your little window to tell your story. And then they have to make those next steps to put themselves physically in proximity with people who have different views. But those are little moments when you can, that's not my experience. My experience is, oh gosh, there's lots now. 1, 2, 3.
Can we step back for just a second to Manifest Destiny,
Yeah.
which is mid-19th century position that the American European settlers were not going to let the French or the British tell us how to colonize and conquer the continent. So it was white Christian nationalism, which seems to be emerging out of America more than Northern European countries. Is it really a globalist project right now that our way is the way for 8 billion people? Or is it more particular to just what happens in North America?
That's an interesting question, and I would love to talk more and understand more about Manifest Destiny. That's not my, this is something I've learned in the PhD program, is how to say that's not my area of specialty. PhDs are really good at that. And like so hesitant to talk on anything that they haven't studied for 12 years. So I'm trying to help work through that with folks. So it's not my area of specialty of the particularness of Manifest Destiny. I think that's interesting and I want to know more about it. In terms of like is it a particular phenomenon for people in this space, or is there some globalness to it? My friend Rabbi Joe Black is speaking this morning over at Central Presbyterian. We were at a wedding together last night, and we're talking about how he was talking about Zionism this morning, and I was talking about Christian nationalism, which many would call Zionism kind of the equivalent of Christian nationalism for Jewish folks. And so I would say that it's not this particular manifestation, Manifest Destiny, is particular to this location, right? And there are, in my perspective, things that make it unique compared to other ways of exclusively tying a religious ideology or a racial ideology to a national identity. That is happening in many places across the world, and it's rising right now. And that's one of the things that people are talking about, is that there is a global rise in authoritarian power dynamics and structures. Netanyahu was reelected this week and is seen as the most far-right exclusive Jewish leader in the history of Israel, and this new government that he's putting forth are even more right-wing. We see this happening in Turkey. We see it happening in, there's another country. Say that again? Italy. Italy just elected yes. So we're seeing that happen in different places across the world. We're also seeing resistance to it. So, this is part of the time that we're in, I think. Okay. Here and then here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these remarks this morning. Would you speak a little bit about how I think most of us were taught that one of the fundamental principles of America is the separation of church and state? Number one, is that historically accurate? Number two, is the Christian nationalist movement saying, no, we should join? We should do away with that doctrine?
Okay, great
Just
question.
comment on that. Thank you.
So I'll start with the second one. Yes, the Christian nationalist movement is often saying we should do away with that, and that was what Warren Wilbert literally said from the pulpit, which was preaching in a church in Grand Junction this summer. And I mean, not that she speaks for the whole Christian nationalist movement, but that is, one of the things is there's a saying that's misused, that separation of church and state was not actually in the Constitution, that was a letter, which is actually accurate, that was from Jefferson, that statement we have religious freedom. So that is in the Constitution. So they're naming that religious freedom does not mean the separation of church and state. So that's one piece. The second, what was the first question you asked? Oh, yeah. Okay, so my opinion on it. So one of the partners that I work with a lot is Americans United for the Separation of Church and State nationally. And I think that one of the challenges is how we understand religion, and so they'll talk about the separation of religion and government. Like church is a particular way of religion, right? It's a Christian word, term. So we talk about the separation of government and religion. What is religion? Go. Religious scholars have lots of debates over the definition of religion. So currently, we have a Supreme Court who is having to define religion. Is religion the Church of Cannabis down on Logan? Is it the spaghetti monster church that brought a case to the Supreme Court? So there are people who are pushing that definition of what is religion. That's one. The other part is how well are you able to take your spiritual and religious beliefs out of who you are and put it on a shelf? Who's able to do that? So it's a complicated question because a lot of people are arguing that's not possible. And it shouldn't be the government's job to define religion when we can't even define religion. So I think that we need to have a more nuanced discussion about how we bring our religious ideas, and they're so woven up, right? They're woven together. Like, what is a religious idea, and what was passed down to me by my grandma? And I just always thought it was religious, but my grandma just used to say that. There's so much nuance in it. I know, like the Masterpiece Cake case, I always was like, nowhere does it say in my Christian teaching that to be Christian means to refuse to serve someone a cake in your business. But for that person, that's how he says it means to live his religion. So it's a difficult question because I don't think they're separate. I think that our understanding of religion is a particular understanding of religion that was born in the past 300 years, quite honestly. And so my preference would be that our laws and our policies are grounded on human rights and equality. And while my understanding of those topics comes from my religious tradition, it does. That doesn't mean that I'm saying that my Christian ideas about those should be institutionalized, but it means that we should be navigating that in dialogue and discussion of what does, really wrestling with, what is a human right? Do I have the right to be served when I walk into a public business? And so those things need to be worked out among us, but when we pull a religion card, as God tells me that I should refuse people service when they walk into my store if they don't align with my understandings, and so one of the tactics right now around countering the end of Roe versus Wade is there are 3 different states that have Jewish communities who have filed lawsuits saying that anti-abortion laws are a invasion of religious freedom for Jewish women, because in Judaism, life does not begin at conception, it begins at first breath. And there are many times when there is an instruction in their Jewish teaching and understanding that you should save the life of the mother and this kind of thing. So I like it as a tactic. I think it's creative because it's challenging, okay, what is our religious idea on these things? But I also am it shouldn't be the basis of our laws of who gets rights, is that I have to call an exception, that I get the right because I'm Jewish or Christian. I want to be speaking for everyone. I mean, that sounded bad. I want to assure that all people have rights and equality, and that it's not just particular people based on their religion. All right.
Thank you, Amanda. We're going to have to cut
That's
it off
it.
here.
Yeah, sorry. I'm like, could keep going forever, so apologize.